And my clock shows it's 10:30, so we will get underway. I want to extend a welcome to everybody who has joined us today for the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission's webinar on environmental, social, and governance for regulators. I want to thank in particular the IOGCC Council of Regulatory Officials for hosting this webinar. And a big thanks to the panelists who've joined us today to share their insights on the developments in the ESG world. We'll get started with the program in just a moment. I've got a slide here that lays out the panelists for you. But before we do turn it over to our moderator and the panelists, there are a few points I want to explain about how we'll conduct this Zoom webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to note for everybody that we are recording the webinar. That's so that we can post the video on the IOGCC website afterwards for viewing by those who may want to hear some part of it again or weren't able to make it. The program will begin with remarks of the panelists. During this session, this part of the program, attendees will remain muted. As an attendee, you will not be able to unmute yourself. Later in the program, though, our moderator, David Hardy, will open the webinar for questions from attendees. At that time, if you have a question, please raise your hand. You can do that by clicking raise hand at the bottom of your screen. We will unmute you to allow you to ask your question. We've disabled the chat and Q&A functions, so raising your hand will be the only way to ask your question. If you have an immediate need for information or assistance, though, please contact our Zoom host, Amy Childers, by email at amy.childers@iogcc.state.ok.us. Note that her email address appears on the bottom of the slide that's now showing. Amy will be watching for emails from attendees so she can help you out. And with that, we'll get on with the program. First, I'd like to introduce our moderator. David Hardy is the Director of Liability Management for the Alberta Energy Regulator. He's also the Associate Official Representative for Alberta at IOGCC, and he currently chairs IOGCC's Council of Regulatory Officials. And thank you, Dave, for both hosting and moderating this webinar. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Lori. So getting right into it, there's many different definitions of ESG and viewpoints on its impact, particularly on sectors such as the oil and gas industry. It's fair to say that it's not just a rumor or a simple financial consideration, and its influence has grown significantly over recent years, and its growth has been projected to continue into the future. So what does this mean to oil and gas regulators? The purpose of this session today is to have a very thoughtful discussion and highlight many of the different aspects of ESG. As Lori mentioned, I'll begin by posing questions to each of the panelists and allowing them approximately 10 minutes to respond. There is a lot of complexity on this topic, and therefore this session will not cover all aspects of the issue, but hopefully provide valuable insight on something that's very topical. And our first panelist today is Tisha Schuler. Tisha founded Adamantine Energy to provide thought leadership to future-proof energy businesses against rising social risk. Tisha consults private clients from Fortune 100 energy companies to nonprofit, environmental organizations in energy policy, business strategy, politics, and community engagement. She also serves as strategic advisor for Stanford University's Natural Gas Initiative. Previously, Tisha served as president and CEO of the Colorado Oil and Gas Association and as principal and vice president with Tetra Tech, a national environmental consulting and engineering firm. Tisha has authored 2 books, Accidentally Adamant, published in 2018, and The Game Changers Playbook, published in 2020. She authors a weekly series entitled Both of These Things Are True and hosts Energy Thinks podcast. Thank you for joining us today, Tisha. I appreciate you being here. The questions that I have for you to begin with is, what is ESG? And secondly, from your vantage point, what are the drivers of ESG?
Dave, thanks so much for having me. Thanks to Lori and IOGCC. It's always a pleasure to be among you. You're going to hear a lot about ESG today, so I'll provide a simple overview and spend most of my time talking about the drivers and why I think we can take this idea of ESG out of politics and think about it as investor and business risk in the context of regulation. So companies have had this idea of corporate responsibility, sustainability reports, and they've been moving down this trajectory of having to provide their investors and stakeholders with some reporting about how their business is behaving in a responsible manner. ESG, environmental, social governance, is now, I believe, the most comprehensive, but more importantly, the most enduring. And the drivers will really articulate why. The most potent driver is how investors are reacting to ESG. And many of you probably saw yesterday's Wall Street Journal had an entire section on ESG investing. And this is really important to think about what's pushing this movement. Why are we hearing about this?
Tisha, I think you're frozen. Tisha, can you hear me? Amy, should we move to the next panelist and wait for Tisha to rejoin? What do you think?
Let's see, sometimes it'll pop out of it pretty quickly. Let's just give it 1 second and see if she'll become unfrozen.
That sounds good.
Yeah, she seems to be pretty stuck. So, oh, yeah, she dropped. So go ahead and we'll move on and we'll get back to her.
Okay, that sounds good. So the next panelist that we have, and we'll certainly cycle back with Tisha when she rejoins, is Megan Harris-Nye. Megan Harris-Nye is a partner leading Ernst & Young's climate change and ESG practice in Canada. She has over 20 years of combined international experience in ESG, sustainability, international government relations, and climate change. She has expertise working in Europe and North America with multinational organizations to develop strategies for building long-term value for stakeholders and society. She spends her time working with boards, executive leadership teams, and operational leadership teams to strategically address climate change and other ESG matters that have a significant impact on access and retention of capital and long-term performance. She has served clients globally across multiple sectors, including the oil and gas, agriculture, mining, power, and utilities, aerospace and defense, financial, and consumer product sectors. Welcome, Megan. The questions I have for you today are, how have things changed for ESG in the past few years? And are the E, the S, and the G prioritized equally, or has a prioritization of sorts occurred?
Thanks, Dave. And I think Tisha has joined us again. So maybe what I'll do is pick up on some of her comments, and then maybe we can go back and forth a little bit here. So in terms of what's changed in the past few years, I would say that it's been increased, as Tisha mentioned, significant focus from a markets perspective. You know, from what we've seen, investors are essentially driving the ESG agenda. There is a lot of discussion globally, you know, around certain ESG issues, and definitely governments have made commitments around ESG. But I would say the primary accelerator has been investors and lenders globally. And we've also seen significant movement towards activist shareholders paying attention to ESG, as I mentioned, global commitments by governments, which is leading to new regulations in certain jurisdictions. And we've definitely seen that in Europe, and we're starting to see that more so in North America. And then also a rise in sort of stakeholder awareness and social awareness, which, you know, I'll touch on your second question in a minute here, Dave, just in terms of the prioritization. And the other thing that we've seen, which would be no surprise to anybody here, just especially working in the energy sector, is increased attention on climate change risk. And we started to see that dovetail into a lot of the discussions in the regulatory realm. the securities regulators globally are placing significant attention on physical and transition climate risk. And that was largely driven by the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which was driven by Mark Carney. And that's given rise to significant focus, globally on climate change. And we expect that trend is going to continue. The third point I'll make is that there's definitely a significant focus on transparency around ESG disclosure. And, it's no surprise, again, to anybody that this space is still very much the wild, wild west as it relates to disclosure. There's many voluntary standards out there for disclosure. And so what we're starting to see is the accounting bodies, such as IFRS and others, are now trying to take more of a lead role to standardize ESG disclosure requirements, because there needs to be standardization, because there's a lot of money attached to ESG now in the capital markets. And so there's a lot of pressure that investors are placing on securities regulators as well as accounting bodies to try to drive towards standardization of ESG disclosure so that there can be comparability from one company to another in terms of how they're performing. To answer your second question, Dave, in terms of the prioritization, I would say it depends, to be honest. And it really depends on the industry. Obviously, within the oil and gas sector, there's a significant focus on the E, and that will remain. We've seen climate change, as I mentioned, rise as probably the most material topic, under the E, whether we agree with it or not. There's such intense stakeholder pressure on the climate agenda that it's difficult to ignore. But that doesn't negate the pressure to focus on other environmental issues. So the E within the energy sector will always continue to be prioritized. However, what we've really seen, I would say, over the last 18 months is more of a significant focus on the S. So we've seen that with, social movements globally. We've seen it through the Black Lives Matter movement. What I've started to see in particular with my clients is increased attention on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we started to see investors place a lot more attention on diversity, equity, inclusion, human capital. Most specifically in Canada, we've seen significant focus on reconciliation with Indigenous communities. And a lot of these issues were always considered to be important within the industry, but what we've seen is just heightened attention and awareness on them. And so I would say that the S is now bubbling to the top in terms of being prioritized more so than it was before.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Megan. Maybe I'll flip back to Tisha. Tisha, are you with us?
I am. I don't even have a solar storm or heat wave to blame on it. So thanks, thanks, Dave.
Please continue. Would you like me to list your questions off again, or are you good to go?
Nope, I got it. I will continue. So, and it's great because there's 3 disruptors, and Megan just covered one of them. So I'll cover the other 2. So one is rise of the millennials, the changing demographics. The second is environmental activism affecting mainstream business risk. And the third is expectations around racial equity and justice. So if you all will show the one slide I have, I want to demonstrate why there is a really important driver to why ESG is becoming so mainstream, and that's rise of the millennials. So what you'll see on this slide is that between now and 2050, the millennials will dominate the population in raw numbers. And it was just this last election in the US in 2020 where millennials rivaled the baby boomers for political influence. So you can take that slide down now. So what it's important for our audience to contemplate in the sense of these drivers is that millennials, won't surprise you to know, lean left by 30 percentage points. And the oldest millennials are turning 40 this year. So millennials are really rising into their prime of their civic, political, and financial prime. And this means that they're not just influencing us from the external stakeholder perspective, but also as investor representatives and as parts of oil and gas companies' workforce. So about 40% of oil and gas companies have a millennial workforce. So although you can imagine that millennials are very concerned about climate, very skeptical about oil and gas industry, there are, of course, Republican millennials in the US. Even where conservative, millennial Republicans are more concerned about climate than older Republican generations, 59%, and they are more skeptical of oil and gas companies. Only 49%, for example, of Republican millennials support fracking. So the reason I want to convey this is because as we think about these pressures around climate and around racial equity and justice, largely driven by an emerging millennial population, these pressures are not going to wane. And even though millennials, like other generations, are getting more conservative, these drivers we expect will stay. The second pressure that I want to mention for you is how environmental activism, which used to be considered, something of a fringe or a movement, is now moving into the mainstream of business risk. I could talk about this for 2 hours, but I'll only talk about it for about maybe 3 minutes, given our robust agenda today. So I'm just going to give one example, and that is to talk about BlackRock, the largest asset investor in the world, and for example, a major investor, often one of the top 3 investors in oil and gas companies in the US, for example. BlackRock in 2020 made climate a central tenet of their investment, their engagement with portfolio companies. And then in 2021, in the beginning of this year, they laid out very specific expectations of portfolio companies, including that they align their business strategy with the tenets of the Paris Agreement. So the reason this is important is when your largest investor is telling you that you need to come up with a business strategy that aligns with a net zero energy future, oil and gas companies are going to engage. And this takes the conversation about ESG drivers out of the idea of political identity. Do I believe, do I not believe, am I left, am I right? This is really about mainstream business risk. We have demographics are changing. We have a public that wants to see a decarbonizing energy future. And we have investors demanding that even very traditional oil and gas companies, from E&P to midstream to gas utilities, come up with a net zero 2050 strategy. So this is why you're going to see companies increasingly actually embracing or engaging in a regulatory framework that will provide them with some certainty. You also see more and more traditional oil and gas companies talking about, for example, a price on carbon. This is because a regulatory framework that lines up with their investor requirements creates more certainty, more consistency, and ability for them to plan on the 30-year time horizon that oil and gas projects require. So the short of the ESG drivers is that these aren't going away, although they may on some level be influenced or driven by politics. From a company perspective, these are about mainstream business risks. What's it going to take to get permitted? What's going to take to attract capital? What's it going to take to get projects built? Thanks, Dave.
Thank you so much, Tisha. Really appreciate it. Next up, we have Brian Steck. Brian has served as a member of Chesapeake Energy Corporation Board of Directors since February 2021. Brian is the chairman of Bonanza Creek Energy Incorporated, where he has served on the board of directors since April 2017. He previously served on the board of directors of California Resource Corporation following its emergence from bankruptcy, and on the board of directors of Penn Virginia Corporation. Brian has 20 years of investment experience as a partner at 3 distinguished investment funds, with much of the recent decade focused on investments in the E&P sector. The views Brian will share today are his own and may be different than those of the companies with which he is affiliated. So Brian, 3 questions for you. Can you share a perspective on how investors and other capital providers are thinking about the E&P industry and ESG initiatives in particular? Second question is, are ESG initiatives in opposition to oil and gas, or is a parallel path possible? And then the third question is, what actions have you seen oil and gas companies take to meet the ESG challenge?
Hi, Dave. Thank you for the questions and for the opportunity to participate in today's discussion. As Megan and Tricia have already mentioned, the role of investors in activism in their prepared remarks, I'm going to continue that trend. As a starting point, I think it's important to understand that the pressure that companies are facing from investors basically two types of pressure. One from investors and capital providers that are disengaging from the sector, and the other from investors and capital providers that are increasing their engagement with the sector, but are seeking significant changes along the lines of the topics such as ESG. So let's start with disengagement. I think the biggest driver of investor disengagement has been the industry's failure to provide competitive investment returns. I'll give you a couple of statistics to make this point. Since 2010, the US E&P industry has lost nearly half of its value, while the S&P 500 has generated total returns of over 300%. During the same period, the energy sector has been the worst performing sector of the S&P 500's 11 sectors for 6 of these 10 years, and has only appeared in the top half of those sectors once. In 2010, as a result of this underperformance in 2010, the energy sector's weighting within the S&P 500 was over 10%. Today, it's closer to 2%. And so with such a small weighting and with such disastrous results, investors have had little reason to engage, and those who have opted out have been rewarded for this decision. Of course, there are other drivers to disengagement, one of which is ESG-driven divestment campaigns in which institutions with assets that now total in the tens of trillions of dollars have committed to reduce or eliminate their investments in fossil fuels. I think it's important to note that this type of disengagement is just a natural response to poor returns and to bad business models. It's not unique to oil and gas. It's just simply how the market works. I think it's also worth noting that when we talk about this trend of disengagement, it also includes bankers. Last year, the Bank of Montreal announced that it was exiting from its lending business to US E&P companies. A few other banks have done the same, and many others have sought to reduce their exposure to the sector. At the other end of the spectrum, pressure is coming from those who are increasing their engagement with the industry while seeking significant changes. And I'll provide 3 examples of this. The first, Tisha just mentioned, is BlackRock, the world's largest investment manager. And as Tisha said, they have chosen to create sustainability as one of the key components of their investment approach. Among a number of things, they are asking, as Tisha mentioned, all companies to articulate how their business models are aligned with the Paris Agreement. They are specifically calling for companies to disclose Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions and their plans for greenhouse gas emission reductions. They are advocating for environmental disclosures that are aligned with the frameworks developed by the TCFD and SASB. And if a company, its plan, its targets, or its disclosures are insufficient, BlackRock will vote against the directors at the annual meeting. They'll also continue to support shareholder proposals that they believe address gaps in a company's approach to climate risk and the energy transition. The second investor I'll use an example here is Kimmeridge Energy. They are a highly successful and influential fund whose activities include private equity, public market investments, and activism. They have developed a thought leadership position within the E&P investor space through a series of activist campaigns, as well as white papers that cover topics such as emissions, the need for carbon exchanges, executive compensation, consolidation, and capital discipline. Another example would be Engine No. 1's successful campaign to place 3 directors on the board of Exxon, which provides another highly consequential example of this type of activism. The final example that I'll use in discussing kind of capital providers and the change that's going on there is JPMorgan Chase. They are the biggest lender to the US oil patch, and while Bank of Montreal and others are reducing their exposure, JPMorgan is staying fully engaged while seeking changes. These changes were most clearly disclosed last month in the release of their Carbon Compass, which is their guide to how ESG will impact their financing decisions. And not surprisingly, it focuses primarily on carbon intensity metrics and focuses on the oil and gas, power, and auto industries. With regard to your second question, Is ESG in opposition to oil and gas, or is a parallel path possible? Some may disagree, but I do not believe that ESG is in fact in opposition to oil and gas. I do believe that it's going to require the industry to restack its priorities in a very meaningful way. And if we think a little bit about Engine No. 1's campaign with Exxon, it provides a really good example of this, in that they didn't seek to have Exxon stop producing oil and gas. Rather, they pressed the company to adopt a business model that recognizes the challenges of the energy transition, fosters environmental stewardship, and places priority on earning economic returns rather than production growth. In other words, the campaign was not about keeping it in the ground. It was focused on managing the enterprise in a manner that generates better returns for investors, while being very mindful of real environmental and long-term demand risks that the sector faces. And for me, this is the parallel path that the whole of the oil and gas industry needs to follow. If we narrow the scope to really just the E within the ESG, I think it may be useful for everybody to consider how hard the renewable energy industry had to work to create economic returns that were competitive with fossil fuels. Now that in many cases they are competitive, I think it's entirely fair to ask the fossil fuel industry to work equally hard to compete with renewables with regard to things like Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. The third question was, what actions are oil and gas companies taking? Well, the first thing is, this is very timely. There's been an absolute acceleration in activity, some of which probably prompted by Engine No. 1's success. But just in the last few weeks, we've seen announcements from Devon, Crescent Point Energy, Schlumberger, the largest network of Canadian oil sands operators, along with the Alberta government, in a big announcement, announced an initiative to achieve net zero emissions in greenhouse gases by 2050 through a shared CCUS project of massive scale. So we're seeing the announcements. We're also seeing announcements outside the oil and gas industry. Target, Rolls-Royce, and other companies in recent weeks have made sustainability announcements. What I think is key is, over time, we're going to need to distinguish between the aspirations of these announcements and real progress. And to do that, we're going to need real data that's comparable between companies. We're also going to need to be able to understand the specific actions that are being taken to reach these goals. Some of which is observable now. Some of the actions that are taking place in the field right now include, the use of enhanced emissions detection technology, including 24/7, real-time monitoring, which we'll hear a little bit about from Chris, I imagine. Replacing combustion, based power in the field with electrification, including the use of e-fracs and electric pump, compression. Utilizing, air-based pneumatic devices and controls, as well as I've already mentioned, carbon capture and sequestration projects. So there's a lot that's going on, in the field today. It's at a relatively early state. The key thing is going to be finding ways in which we can measure and manage that progress and evaluate the success that different companies are having in reaching these new targets. I hope that's helpful.
Very, thank you so much, Brian. Moving on is Jason Isaac. Jason is a senior manager and distinguished fellow of Life Powered, a project from the Texas Public Policy Foundation to raise America's energy IQ. Prior to joining Life Powered, Jason was elected 4 times as a Texas state representative for the Hayes Blanco counties and in the Texas Hill Country. During his 8 years of service, he successfully passed legislation to reduce taxes, strengthen election integrity, improve public education, preserve Second Amendment rights, protect local groundwater, and protect private property rights. He was repeatedly honored for his commitment to limited government and proved to be an effective leader, excelling at both advocating for conservative principles and working across the aisle to find responsible solutions for the future of the Lone Star State. Jason has appeared on national news shows, and his commentaries have been published in The Hill, The Washington Examiner, The Daily Caller, and in other publications. So Jason, question for you is, what is your perspective on ESG funds?
Hey, thanks for the question very much. This is something that our work at Life Powered and the Texas Public Policy Foundation have been following for years now and looking at these ESG funds. And one of the things that we've seen is they typically charge much higher fees. And that's of concern. And just earlier, I think it was maybe earlier this week or late last week, the Supreme Court has a ruling in the Goldman Sachs case that leaves open a path for securities fraud claims based on generic ESG statements. And later this week, maybe today or tomorrow, we will release the Texas Public Policy Foundation, partnered with C. Boyd & Gray, Ambassador Gray and his firm, to write a paper that lays the foundation for potential lawsuits from attorneys generals and other plaintiffs about, and the title of the paper that we're going to release, Corporate Collusion, Liability Risk for ESG's Agenda to Limit Choice, Charge Higher Fees, and Rig the Market. We saw this happening in Texas with banks and financial institutions not making funds available merely because someone was in the production of oil and gas or was a service company to oil and gas exploration and production companies. When this bill was up, we had this bill filed to really push back against this energy discrimination that was based on legislation that was passed in 2017, my last legislative term in the Texas House, that said there was a bill, the model was based on Israel. And there's a bill that we passed in Texas that says if you're going to boycott, divest, or sanction Israel, you're no longer welcome to do business with the state of Texas. And so I crafted that legislation and based it on production of oil and gas and really fossil fuels. And if you're going to discriminate or boycott companies that produce oil and gas, then you're no longer welcome to do business with the state of Texas. That includes municipalities as well. So all divisions of the state, including subdivisions of the state. And just to give you an example, there's over $300 billion in our pension funds that are managed and responsible of the state. There's almost $400 billion in local municipal debt. And when this bill finally passed the House and the Senate, I think it was May 25th, right around that time frame, just last month, Stacey Garrity, the Pennsylvania treasurer, came out and warned financial institutions and banks that if they're going to discriminate against oil and gas, then she's going to pull their $4 billion of pension management funds out of those banks. So we've seen this collusion by really what I refer to as a cartel and have a pretty good case that they are colluding against people and doing so illegally. You look at what BlackRock, they've got over $9 trillion in managed assets. If that were GDP, they'd be the third largest country in the world. They're part of this group called the Climate Action 100 Plus. That's over $50 trillion in managed assets that is trying to pressure companies into going essentially net zero. Now, we've done a significant amount of research at the Texas Public Policy Foundation and can show you that if we completely eliminate fossil fuels, and this is using the same models that the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change uses, that if we eliminate all fossil fuels by 2030 in the US, that the temperature differentiation by 2100 is less than 0.2 of a degree. And like Chris Wright says at Liberty Oilfield Services in his Bettering Human Lives report, his ESG statement, which is phenomenal, and I encourage those of you listening to read it, Bettering Human Lives from Liberty Oilfield, he talks about harmful pollution and greenhouse gases and how the left has really turned them into one thing of harmful, dirty pollutants and emissions, but they're completely not. You have the 6 criteria pollutants that are harmful to human health, in which the US has been a world leader at reducing those 77% in the last 50 years. But this cartel is focusing on CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, which are not harmful to human lives, which are actually necessary for life on Earth. But this paper that we're releasing later this week will really lay the foundation for attorneys generals. And I think to me, the most compelling point of the paper is that green activists and lenders may have established an illegal hub and spoke conspiracy. The federal antitrust law prohibits boycott agreements instigated by a third party to coordinate firms that ordinarily compete against each other, banks, to unreasonably restrain market condition. or more market competition. In these hub and spoke conspiracies, competitors can violate the law even without direct communication with each other. But if you look at the Climate Action Plus 100 website, there's over 150 banks and financial institutions listed. They're clearly communicating with one another on this issue. It's an antitrust law, it's a hub and spoke conspiracy. This is cartel, which a firm, the hub, organizes collusion, the rim of the wheel, if you will, among upstream and downstream firms, not upstream oil and gas, but financial institutions through these vertical restraints. These pressure campaigns by environmentalist activist groups are the possible hubs, followed by the pattern of announcements and parallel contact by banks. We see bank after bank after bank announcing that they're no longer going to loan money to people that produce fossil fuels, or no longer more than 25% of their revenues, as is the case in BlackRock and Bank of the West. So they're clearly operating within parallel, but they might follow a similar classic pattern of shuttling commitments, where you've got this green activist alarmist group that's pressuring different banks to adopt the same principles or the same commitments. As evidence of agreement among the spokes is often found in vertical coordination between the hub and spokes. And that's just a segment of the paper that we'll release, I believe, tomorrow from the Texas Public Policy Foundation and our project called Life Powered. Now in Texas, we now have a law. Senate Bill 13 was passed, and just weeks ago, the governor signed it into law, that sends a wake-up call to these financial institutions that if they're going to discriminate against Texas energy producers, really American energy producers that produce energy more responsibly, environmentally responsibly than anywhere else in the world, then they're no longer going to be welcome to do business. And so it's the first state in the nation to push back against these companies that are really discriminating against responsible energy producers, not only in Texas, but in the United States. So there's a lot of alarm with some of this ESG narrative, the higher fees that the funds are charging. And really when you see companies like BlackRock that are directing the companies that they invest in to invest into other funds that BlackRock owns and manages, it seems to me like, again, this cartel is colluding to prop up investments into other things that may sound politically correct, but don't have the fiduciary responsibility that's required in law by ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Fund, and other state funds that require this fiduciary responsibility. So first and foremost, that's where our fund managers need to be within our states and our regulators, not focusing on any other principles. So I hope that answers your question, a little bit long-winded, but I would recommend that people look at Life Powered and the Texas Public Policy Foundation for the release of this paper, I believe, tomorrow.
Thank you so much, Jason, for your thoughts. We're going to move on to Chris Romer. Chris is the CEO of Project Canary, which has a simple mission to mitigate climate change by helping the energy supply chain and the oil and gas industry reduce methane and other fugitive gas. Missions through continuous monitoring and a trusted certification process called TrustWell. Project Canary has contracts with E&P and midstream companies across the country to help them solve this critical environmental problem, and donates a substantial amount of the profits to plugging abandoned oil and gas wells. It is committed to the 2 billion citizens living in energy poverty and the common sense solution of serving them with clean energy that fits our GHG budget. Chris has served as a Colorado State Senator from 2006 to 2010, where he focused on energy policy, higher education, innovation, and improving access and quality of K-12 education. From 1983 to 2008, he was a public finance banker with JP Morgan and Citibank, specializing in clean power, energy, utility, higher education, and transportation finance. Thanks for being with us here today, Chris. The two questions for you today are, what does the leading edge of ESG look like? And what should governments and regulators consider when it comes to ESG?
Right. Well, thank David. David, thank you a bunch, and it's good to be on today. First, I think it's always good to think about an analogy of what's going on. This ESG movement is like a 100-foot tsunami that's going to blow through the energy markets globally. It's not just a U.S. phenomena. It's not a Texas phenomena. It's blowing through, and denial and hope are not good strategies when something disruptive happens. I've been in and around Wall Street and in the state Senate for a long time. I've rarely seen something this big and this disruptive. I think as that 100-foot tsunami example gets started, I think it was actually only about 10 to 15 feet out of the water until in a single week, Exxon had 3 board members removed, Shell lost a court case in Europe, and BlackRock slapped British Petroleum's arms pretty hard. And you know, I think the problem is that, and I used to think about this as a state senator, every once in a while I go, there go my people, and I better start leading them. I think that's what's happening in the energy markets. And Tisha nailed it. There go the consumers, and the consumers have spoken, and they really want ESG. And we have the cleanest carbon on the planet. We're going to use carbon for a lot more, but we're going to need to move away from an extractive relationship with carbon to a regenerative relationship with carbon, where we're actually going to pull it out of the ground. We're going to have a very granular accounting system, even in Texas, and we're actually going to put it back. And that's where this is going. And so sometime in life, it's not where the puck has been. It's not where the puck currently is. It's where the puck is going. And where the puck is going now is ESG. You know, a year ago, I was at a Joel Frank meeting in Houston. Didn't know a lot of people in the industry because I'm a little bit new to this. And I stood up and said, hey, after a week after Larry Fink at BlackRock announced his intentions, and I said, folks, I don't know many of you, but the E in ESG is gonna go data driven, and it's gonna start here and now. And you know, half the people in the room threw me dagger eyes, and the other half gave me their business cards. And I think the last 12 months have only indicated more that this is a 100-foot tsunami, so you got to get ready. So let me just step back and say, what does that mean for a state regulator? And first and foremost, as a former state senator, I always used to walk in the building and say, may I please do no harm today? So I hope your state legislators are treating you well and giving you directive. But I do think your regulations need to reflect the fact that this is absolutely going to happen. And we need to have good policy to create dense energy that's affordable, that is consistent with climate change. So let's be real here. We've had this externality called carbon that's been out of the equation. When you have something foundational in economics that's not in the economic equations, a lot of stupid things happen. So we just need to bring the doggone thing into the equation. So what does that mean? That means we actually have to measure things. In an accounting system, I mean, once upon a time, we actually didn't have audited financials. Yikes. We didn't have audited financials, and yet we had a stock market. So we're now going to have an accounting system for carbon that's going to work. The good news, and what I'm seeing foundationally, is that companies are starting to compete with each other on ESG, just in the same way they compete with each other on price. And that's healthy, because we're going to have great common sense market-based solutions for climate change that are actually going to work. And the great way to do that is start with ESG. So where do I come from? I come from Colorado, which has been doing this a lot. We were the first place on the planet to require continuous monitoring, to really put independent accountability around this process of drilling oil and gas. There's nothing wrong with accountability. Accountability is good. Transparency is good. Why would you allow people to have a free rider problem to let one well pad cheat and do something wrong while another well pad gets held accountable? What I'll tell you for the regulators is this ESG phenomena is going to go to the well pad. It's no longer going to be at the company level. It's already going to go to the compressor stations. It's going to go to the well pad. There are going to be devices in very granular way that give you independent, trusted data to help bring this down. The good news is when we do that, we're going to certify that we have the cleanest LNG on the planet. We're going to go use that to solve climate change, and it's going to be good for the market in your state. So I think it's important just to think this through from a North American perspective. ESG is here to stay. The capital markets are just not going to give you money anymore. Sorry for the previous speaker. That ship has sailed. So any ability in waving your hands, it's not going to happen. The capital markets are not going to give you money without ESG strategies. What that means is that regulators can now think through, what does that mean as they start to set up regulations that are supportive of a healthy oil and gas market? We did that in Colorado. Thank you, COGCC. It's working, we're drilling, we're doing well, and it can work elsewhere. So my point to you all is, look, ESG is here to stay. We're gonna bring it in. It is really a 100-foot tsunami, and trust me, it's only 20 feet out of the water. So you have two choices with you in your state and the drillers in your state and the producers in your state. You can either get hit by that wave and get crushed by it, or you can start to surf the wave and do what we should do, which is use this amazing thing of dense energy to help 2 billion people on this planet get out of energy poverty, and at the same time, we can solve climate change. It's doable. It's just pipes and gases. We can do this, but denial is not a strategy, and I think the regulators have a really important role to play here. Lastly, the one thing we learned quickly is that the E is not just about methane and CO2e. The E is also about fracking fluids. This industry had an existential issue when fracking fluids almost shut the industry down many years ago. And the way we solved it was with frac focus. We need to adopt the same kind of radical transparency to solve this problem, and the regulators can lead the way.
Wonderful, Chris. Thank you for your commentary. So we've reached the end of our panelists that are with us today. And so am I turning it over to you, Amy?
Well, I was going to say that Alex should be joining us shortly. So we hope that he gets here and that we can have his comments here in a few minutes. But while we move forward, I just want to let you all know we're going to allow some questions right now. Again, we may have another panelist join and have some more comments from him, but we're going to open it up to questions. Please, if you have a question, raise your hand by clicking raise hand at the bottom of your screen. I will unmute you to allow you to ask your question. You will need to accept the unmute prompt you will receive from me. And please remember to identify yourself before asking your question. So we're going to get started. We have a question and it's Matthew.
Matthew, please go ahead.
Well, actually, I think Matthew is muted, but I think Adrian Sandoval is. Let's see. I'm sorry. We're just having some trouble getting this unmute. Let's see. Okay. Adrian. There you go. Adrian and Matthew, I'll work on getting you unmuted. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted at this point. This is Adrian Sandoval. I'm the New Mexico Oil Conservation Division Director. And I was just, I guess I have a couple questions. First, I think it was Chris who talked about, some of the actions that states have taken and regulators have taken. And I'm just curious as to sort of what your perspective would be in terms of how states should be addressing ESG and moving forward.
Adrian, great question. I mean, in a perfect world, and again, I'll be self-disclosed here, I'm a Democrat for fracking, which is getting to be a small club. But, if you're in Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, it would be wonderful if those 3 states could get together and have a common philosophy on what data is required to get a well, drill a well, how to think about produced water, fresh water, all the things. I mean, our Trust Well product has 24 categories in which we provide both dynamic and historic information. So it's like a Carfax and an Equifax together. And we're finding a lot of demand for that. I think there's a lot of regulatory value in doing that. I'll also just throw it out there because an awful lot of the investment world only looked at the reserve-based and the molecules in the ground. Very few investors paid attention to the liability issues here. There is a tremendous amount of liability on these balance sheets related to plug and abandonment of old wells. There are an awful lot of companies that are now going into bankruptcy that we need to work through. So I wish Colorado, New Mexico, and Wyoming, Utah too, that are all in the same area, because I think we have the similar types of issues. Maybe a little bit Texas in the same issue in the Permian, but it would be really wonderful if there was a commonality to the way in which people had rules for drilling, because I think it would make it easier on the companies to do business in multiple states. That's a wish. I know there's lots of different philosophy on this, but I just go back to the fracking fluid issue. There was a reason why radical transparency solved the fracking fluid issue. The same is going to be true with methane emissions. Why are we leaking our product? It just makes no sense. We need to design it to stop the leaks. And I think the states should get together and come up with a common policy. And it would really help us as we start to think through how to talk to Wall Street about those common policies.
Thanks, Chris. Sort of on that line, you mentioned orphan wells and having to plug and abandon and sort of that risk. Do you see ESG as a sort of a driver for wells being orphaned?
I think companies are going to compete for capital and for investors in lots of different ways. And I'm hearing a lot of activity around what's the tail risk under climate on P&A wells. And the history in the industry has often been the lower, more poorly capitalized companies end up with those wells. What worries me in the divestiture movement, and this is where I really disagree with the left on this, getting rid of selling the oil and gas stocks, you don't get to participate anymore. And it's super important that we continue to participate and convince these companies to plug and abandon these wells. And I think we should create incentives between the various states that P&A these wells. I'd also like to see a carbon offset developed in the P&A policy and be happy to work with you on that.
Thank you. And last but not least, I guess I'd be curious to hear from any of the panelists on this. So IOGCC passed a resolution at the last meeting, which basically said that we don't agree with ESG funds. And I would just be curious on the different panelists' perspective on that resolution and how it, what impacts it might have on a broader scale.
For the panelists, if you want to raise your hand to see who wants to go first, that would be helpful.
Also, if the panelists would turn on your videos and be prepared. Yeah, thank you. And then again, whoever wants to take that question.
I'll jump in. We've seen that this ESG really being used as a weapon to discriminate against responsible energy. You talk about emissions. We can get natural gas. There's a NEDL report, the National Energy Technology Laboratory report, that shows that we can get natural gas from the United States to India and China with fewer life cycle emissions, greater than 40% fewer than getting that same natural gas to those locations in India and China than from Russia. But you don't see the energy discrimination efforts being launched in Russia and China and denying access and finance in other countries. You tend to see it typically towards European and United States companies. And so it's really in the view of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, the Life Powered Project, we're just seeing this weaponization of ESG being used against responsible production of energy. And that's why we advocated for the passage of Senate Bill 13 in Texas, which will, I think the governor said something along the lines, if you're going to boycott Texas, then Texas is going to boycott you. And we're going to work that model in other states where we see Governor Gordon in Wyoming, when he was the treasurer, pushed back against Bank of the West for discriminating against fossil fuel production. Now, Pennsylvania and other states, we see some good opportunities to move this legislation forward. And there's also fiduciary responsibility. First and foremost, you should have pensions, and like the teacher retirement system and the employee retirement system in Texas have adopted principles that fiduciary responsibility above and beyond any other measurement is the most important one that they're going to look towards in providing returns for their recipients of those funds.
Thank you, Jason. Tisha, your hand is up. Over to you.
Sure. So the real opportunity of thinking about ESG in the context of drivers and disruptors is to transcend the idea of the politics of ESG and contemplate instead the layers of stakeholders and the changes that are happening that really aren't reversible. So just to look, for example, at the rise of the millennials and the things that these stakeholders, investors, regulators, and voters care about, gives companies the opportunity to think in the context of how can we bridge the various political divides, and how can we create a common vision for the future? And ESG provides a really nice context to look at shared goals around decarbonization, shared goals around affordable, always on, always reliable energy, and shared goals around energy security. And this is a way to take this out of divisiveness and into the idea of a shared direction. And I think it's really important in the context of how regulators are participating in this is to think about the very real pressures companies are under. And companies don't have the luxury of saying, we want to fight this out. They have the absolute responsibility to attract capital, to meet their operational obligations, and to plan for this decarbonizing energy future. And ESG provides a nice context to do that. Are some funds irresponsible or mislabeled or have fees that are too high? Perhaps. But the investors are the ones providing the capital for the companies to operate. And we really do have to be responsive and thoughtful about the pressures that they're under and the pressures they put on operators.
Thank you very much, Tisha. Brian, your hand is up. Over to you.
Sure. I think being opposed to ESG investing is almost like being opposed to the tides or the rising of the sun. You know, you may like it, you may not like it, it may be inconvenient to you, but it's real and it's not going to go away, you know. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us, whether we're investors, whether we're, as I am, a director at a couple of E&P companies, or as regulators, to find a way to engage, which is I think a big part of of what we just heard from Tisha. I think it's also important to recognize, at least in my experience in working with the teams at oil and gas companies, is that they don't resent it. They actually get excited and engaged when given an opportunity to find ways to operate their business profitably, but in a way that is having less impact on the environment, that is consistent with the ESG objectives of investors, because many of them are millennials. Many of them share these beliefs. And like Chris, as a Democrat who is pro-fracking, they believe that you can do both. And so to categorize ESG as being in opposition to the industry, I think is, there's certainly elements of that's true, but it's not true categorically. Look at the level of support that you get from teams when given an opportunity to take on a project that will improve emissions.
Thank you very much. Megan, your hand is up. Please continue.
Just wanted to make a quick comment just as it relates to fiduciary duty and, the role of oil and gas, in addressing the global transition, and whether we agree or not, there is a role to play for oil and gas in the global economy. And I think we're all in agreement about that. But I think there's also recognition that this transition is happening. And, thinking about it from an investor perspective and from a company perspective, there's also competitive advantage to be gained by tackling ESG. And we've seen that with, several companies that have really been progressive. Not only has that allowed them to retain capital, they've been able to get access to different streams of capital, as well as navigate, the global carbon credit market, which is going to grow exponentially over the coming years. And so, it's this concept of using ESG to move toward value creation and competitive advantage, which I think we're on the cusp of. But we've started to see a lot of organizations in the energy sector start to think about it from that lens and take advantage of what's going on instead of looking at it as a negative. And I see that as a huge opportunity in the sector. And I'm an advocate for oil and gas, but I've definitely seen my clients start to move in that direction, and they're benefiting from it. So that's just my take on this topic.
Thank you so much, Megan. Our final panelist, Alex, has made his way onto into our meeting. Welcome, Alex. I am going to introduce you, and I appreciate your coming at this cold. But anyway, I'm going to pose a couple questions your way, and then we'll pick it up where we were with taking questions from the folks. So Alex Hergott is a nationally recognized infrastructure policy and project delivery expert with experience that spans a broad range of industries. Alex created their Permitting Institute after nearly 2 decades of creating bipartisan partnerships and common sense reforms in Congress, the executive branch, and in the private sector. He previously served as Executive Director of the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council, Director of Infrastructure for the Council of Environmental Quality, Deputy Staff Director for the U.S. Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, Legislative Director for U.S. Senator James N. Inhofe, and Director of Transportation and Infrastructure for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. His work continues to focus on the needed infrastructure improvements that will deliver economic growth while ensuring a comprehensive review of policies in place to minimize impacts on the natural environment. Alex, thanks for being here today. And the questions for you are, from a project perspective, what do you see as the impact of ESG on the ground? What opportunities have resulted from ESG in that space? And if there is time, what federal, regional, and state and local bodies touch on this? Over to you, Alex.
Sure. Thank you, and I appreciate that. Is audio coming through okay?
It is.
So I think, and I appreciate the introduction. I think when it comes to building infrastructure, whether it be pipelines or whether it be roads and bridges, it's important to keep in mind on who actually owns the assets. Is it the companies? Is it the state? Is it the public? And in many cases, these kinds of new elements, whether it be ESG or environmental justice or things involving additional subjective standards on life cycle cost or resiliency, or even government-to-government consultation with tribes. Every one of these new elements adds an additional element of risk, right? And climate risk is not just physical. It also involves all other elements that have yet to be defined. And so if you're putting capital at risk on an infrastructure project, all these things are not only taken into account by the debt and equity markets, but also on the amount of revenue that needs to be raised, or at the end of the day, those costs are deferred and or relayed on to the ratepayers, because now they are built into the mandate on building infrastructure. And although ESG and listening to the other panelists while over audio, I think it's important that as we transition to ESG, which is coming, that there's a recognition that the regulatory risk is having a significant chilling effect on close to $600 billion worth of new oil and gas, solar and wind projects, as there's evolving social pressure to on what gauge is the appropriate level on the appropriate level of corporate governance. And just this morning, in my meetings over at CFPB and then at SEC and then over at Treasury, you have about 9 cooks in the kitchen that will end up putting out regs, even as much as DOL and ERISA or NCUA and over in the FDIC. There's no real understanding at this point on where the mile markers are, where are the goalposts. And what that does for the investment community and what that does for these projects that we need to build creates an additional hurdle that is something that for regulators needs to be understood and educated on, because at the end of the day, the additional cost of what this would be is overhead needs to be built into the overall project cost and not borne by the unsuspecting taxpayers and ratepayers that are going to be building that are or receiving those services. And so the pricing of risk on what ESG or ESG rather means and how that's going to affect the universe of projects that are actually going to be built or at least shovel ready over the next 6 months is something that the companies that I work with every day, or NCSL or with the National Governors Association, is what is it going to look like 2 years from now? Because the project horizon is about 7 years. It's 2 years to get the financing to work with local legislators on increasing excise taxes or doing a debt offering, then about 2.5 years in the environmental review process, and then another 2 years to actually purchase many of the materials that are required and the requisite Buy America waivers and new regulations that come in that somewhat change the ground underneath a developer, whether it be a pipeline or whether it be a marginal well, you name it. And then it actually takes about a year and a half to build some of these LDCs and these gas connection sites. And so I think there is a disconnect between the policy advocates on what ESG is looking like and what it actually takes to build a project on the ground. And reconciling that difference is important, not regardless of what side folks are on how aggressive ESG must be, but at the end of the day, it's taking into account the capital that is being put at risk not necessarily hiding or at least turning into a negative externalities, what the cost of new corporate governance that's ESG based. And I'm not necessarily sure that was the question or the answer to the question, but I think I supplied a list, I think last week, of the projects that the Permitting Institute, which is a nonprofit, is tracking as we work with tribes and the conservation and in addition to the oil and gas and your traditional developers. And the level of uncertainty out there on the regulatory environment is creating a risk that is now about 20 to 30% of project cost, whereas 10 years ago it was about 5%. And that's something that although a developer may use in their initial forecasting, the end user is the one that ends up paying for that overhead, and that's not being well communicated on many of the policies that are emerging on ESG. It's not informing policymakers to assist regulators on what the appropriate level of regulation is and what is the cost of that risk. And in many cases, it's forcing projects out of the market, and that's not where we want it. So this transition is going to be key because over the next 2-3 years, as we pull ourselves out of an economic downturn resulting from a pandemic, we can't move in one direction without looking at the cumulative impacts of what these policies will have on a market of which regulators do not control, which is folks actually coming to the market to want to build something.
Thank you very much for your comments, Alex. Chris, you've had your hand up for a while. Over to you.
Sure, and Alex, thank you. And I do think it's important to think through as the bar goes up on being more pristine in the way in which we extract oil and gas. It's really important to think through how to decarbonize both the pipes and the wires. What bothers me is the lack of real hardcore math and science in this debate. We need to decarbonize both the pipes and the wires. This infrastructure is super expensive. It's not going to go there. We're probably going to change a little bit what goes into those pipes over time, but why in the world would we give up resilient low carbon systems with an S? And I think one of the challenges that's out there is because the industry isn't getting with the millennials' view on fossil fuels, in many states, this conversation about 100% electrification and 100% renewable is actually way taking over the actual ability to deal with it. And so as Tisha showed, the millennials have a view on fossil fuels that's really a problem. We're going to use fossil fuels for a lot longer than people think. The regulators need to up their game, probably up their regulations. I think flaring is a great example. It's just become, understood that it's a bad issue and something that needs to get cleaned up. And then by state, it's happening, and it's, it's obviously hard because in certain places the infrastructure, and sometimes it's the federal government who's at fault here, as Alex indicated. But I really think we need to be more grown up about the way we're going to do U.S. energy policy. We're going to use fossil fuels for a couple more decades. We absolutely can decarbonize it, and we can kick the crap out of the international markets with our clean, certified U.S. carbon. We should be absolutely out competing the double dirty Russian gas. But we can only do that if we're really thoughtful and we work together to certify that the U.S. has the cleanest carbon on the planet. Let's put it in these tankers. We've been working with 6 different LNG companies, and they've all told us this is going to net zero. This is going to go to net zero emissions, and it's really incumbent on regulators to help their states get ahead of this, or else your state is simply going to be uncompetitive. And I hate to be the messenger, but that's where this is going.
Thank you so much, Chris. Questions from attendees, please raise your hands if you have any questions for any of our panelists.
Dave, we have a question from Jeremy
Yes.
Price. Jeremy, I'm going to try to unmute you.
Jeremy, please go
There you
ahead.
Jeremy.
Hey, thanks,
Reminder,
guys.
introduce yourself, please. Thank you.
Yep. Jeremy Price, Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission Chair. My question is for, a number of the attendees have
Oh, Jeremy, you're muted again.
Here we go. We good now?
Yeah, we're good.
So Jeremy Price, Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. The question I have is, it seems like the majority of attendees, or I'm sorry, of the panelists have said that ESG is here to stay, and that it's incumbent upon us to adapt, and development can occur in harmony with the goals of this ESG movement. From Alaska, it appears that whether it's BlackRock or other financial institutions, they look at Alaska and they say the Arctic development should not occur, that it doesn't necessarily only include ANWR, but the Arctic. And some might say the Arctic includes the entire state of Alaska, not just the North Slope of Alaska. So I'm curious what the panelists really think about our situation. Do you really think that it's a harmonious relationship that can occur where development and ESG can occur congruently, or is it really a keep it in the ground on our situation? What do you guys think?
Any panelists?
I was late and I don't want to overstep, but from my perspective, I think that we just need to look at the past, whether it be the conformity rules with new single occupancy vehicle lanes and transportation, which was a policy from about 10 years ago, biasing towards transit. Now we find ourselves in a situation where it's extremely difficult to build new roads, even though freight bottlenecks are building up, and we have to pull back a bit of the standards on how we enforce the National Area Ambient Quality Standards on NOx and SOx and the true acid rain type pollutants. But I think it's important to recognize that there's trade-offs. If we're going to implement ESG, then maybe we need to take a hard look at delisting lesser parrot chicken and some of the other priorities that we have from an environmental and a human health and safety standpoint, and that project developers can't absorb all of these costs without the expectation that there's actually going to be development, and take into account the fact that 26 of the largest wind and solar and transmission renewable energy projects in the country right now are being sued by the Centers for Biological Diversity, Audubon, and the Sierra Club, and the local acolytes. So those same companies, Dominion, Duke, ESG, or pardon me, NextEra Resources, and several others, are no longer the enemy anymore. The war on coal is over. They've moved to transition to renewable energy. And although ESG priorities are here to stay, at the same time, there needs to be a counterbalance of trade-offs to remove the headwinds so that overall development isn't bearing the cost of all social political decisions on what should be a priority, including what is now the millennial approach that someone brought up. And so we have to look at it like adults, truly like adults. And I'm not sure people actually know what it takes to wildcat on a mining project or to put additional risk out and capital on how to build these things. And they're only looking at it from a silo, and we have to look at it holistically, or else we're going to make the same mistakes of the past.
Thank you, Alex. Or any other panelists interested in responding? Tisha.
Yeah, I'll just take a shot. I would never want to opine on situation on the ground in Alaska, which is extraordinarily complex, but I'll draw parallels to pipeline development and companies that face this sort of absolute yes or no permitting environment, and how that may or may not be relevant to the situation in Alaska. How we advise companies who are facing this divisive political environment, we're against you 100%, and there's no scenario where we will accept you, is to look first for shared aspirations, which tends to be in this environment around a decarbonizing energy future with reliable, affordable, secure energy. Because with the shared aspiration, you change the conversation from us versus them, political sides at war, my facts versus your facts, into one of, okay, if we can agree on the long-term, the 30-year or the 50-year outcome, then we make a space to have the conversation about the steps we need in between. And domestic energy is going, and domestic mining is going to be extraordinarily important for us to meet our ultimate shared energy goals. But we have to create space for that conversation. And I think the most harmful approach that we take is whoever we are going to educate them who don't understand, because no one wants to be told to change their mind, but everyone wants to look for a path forward to reach some shared aspirations. And so although this sounds sort of arm wavy and soft, it's actually very fundamental to how oil and gas companies are going to get things built in a world where the millennials are taking charge of everything. And so I think it's really fundamentally important to frame away from us versus them into what do we have in common, and how can we make space for the conversation about what we need to do from here to there, which is going to require a lot of mining, a lot of fossil fuels, a lot of building of new infrastructure.
Thank you so much, Tisha. Does any other panelist have a comment, or should we move to another question? Going once, Going twice.
I'll jump in. As I had a conversation with Governor Mike Dunleavy from Alaska earlier this year, talking about this very thing with a panel. And it's weaponization of ESG against Alaska. It's financial institutions not wanting to have development in this quote unquote pristine habitat. And now Alaska is having to invest its own resources. Taxpayer dollars are being used to produce oil and gas in the state of Alaska because private companies can't get access to capital, which is increasing the cost, increasing the burden to taxpayers. And these companies, meanwhile, these other companies that are denying financial investments in Alaska are using their dollars to prop up investments in less dense energy. And you look at the amount of habitat, if we're so concerned about habitat, shouldn't we be concerned about the habitat that's required for solar? Because it's 27 times the amount of land that's required to produce an equivalent amount of energy of that of natural gas. Or wind, which is over 100 times the amount of land that's required to produce the equivalent energy of natural gas. It just doesn't make sense. It's extremely hypocritical. And it's unfortunate to people in Alaska who are facing economic challenges because this capital is being not allowed in the state of Alaska. It's unfortunate, but it's happening, and it's purely political.
Thank you, Jason. If there's no other panelists that want to weigh in, Chris, you took yourself off mute. Do you want to provide some commentary?
I'm good.
Okay.
Next.
Thanks,
yeah.
Jeremy. We appreciate it. We've got another question from Richard Schultz. Let's see, Richard, I'm going to try to unmute you. Let's see how that goes. There we go. Richard, introduce yourself, please.
Okay, thanks very much. My name is Richard Schultz. I'm a geomechanicist in Houston, Texas. And first, I'd like to congratulate IOGCC for putting this together and bringing in a range of diverse viewpoints. It certainly is a contentious issue, but it also is an overriding one in both the US and in the world, because large companies that are involved in oil and gas are clearly investing in alternative technologies, CCUS and renewables and others. No one argues that fossil fuels are going away. They can't. We can't make plastics out of sunlight, for example. And everyone recognizes that. But my question here has to do with regulation and our regulatory environment toward oil and gas in this country and in the ones that we influence. Specifically, IOGCC passed a resolution, as Adrienne mentioned. It's resolution 21.054 that came across as written as quite hostile, or kind of a us versus them mentality that IOGC has adopted that seems to go against what a number of the panelists have been saying and what the larger trends are that investors and boards of directors and companies across all sectors of the business world are dealing with. So I'd like to ask how IOGCC, as the lead regulatory agency that represents state regulators for oil and gas, can reconcile itself with what is actually happening versus resolutions that are being passed that they have adopted and therefore they have to follow through on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question, Richard. I'm wondering who to throw the question to. Is it you, Lori?
I would note that our resolution speaks for itself. It's out there on our website for anybody that wants to take a look at it. And we are going to be following up with some of the federal agencies to work on implementation of that resolution. I do believe that it lays out in the body of the resolution the specific concerns that the IOGCC expressed in the resolution, and we've got some work to do to work with the federal agencies to implement that resolution. So that's about all I can say at this point about it. I don't know, I'd welcome any comments on it from the panelists.
Wonderful, thank you, Lori.
Hey, David, I just have one comment on that. It goes to my comment about a holistic nature. But you see the chart behind me, which I bring everywhere on speeches. It is that those are up to 65 federal, state, and local laws that were passed over a period of 40 years in a vacuum. It's very siloed, whether it be the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water Act and then the Clean Air Act. and none of them were really harmonized, which is the issue that we're dealing with now. And NEPA was supposed to bring all of those together so we bring all relevant information up, we can evaluate the risks and the benefits in the apolitical way and inform regulators and the public at large. The problem that we're going to have is a bit of a groupthink that we're just running off a cliff on ESG, which I don't mind if that is the policy that companies that are putting capital at risk want to emerge with. The difference is that we can't have new regs coming out of Treasury and then SEC and then integrity testing out of the Fed, along with the new requirements out of DOL and FDIC that were very similar to what happened on the RFS fight, where we had 10, 15 years ago. We were putting ourselves in a box where we knew that we were going to have a renewable standard, but then 2 years later, we were importing all of the biomass from Brazil because we were trying to meet this overarching need to have a social policy as far as energy is concerned. And then social cost of carbon, which has now led to ESG, is likely to lead to a patchwork, because I know firsthand here in sweltering DC that all of those individual agencies are not working together. They're working in a vacuum on different timelines according to the Administrative Procedures Act. Some of them are regulation, some of them are going to be statutes coming out of Congress. And so we have too many cooks in the kitchen that want to get onto the ESG bandwagon. And what's going to happen is a patchwork that then feeds into the evolved, whether it's ISO or PJM or what's happening with the spot and demand markets when it comes to electricity. It is going to be a cluster that we're going to have to walk ourselves back from. So you have the overarching catalyst of companies that are now making this part of their corporate governance. And then there's the actual implementation of where are we going to be 2 years from now? If you're Williams, or if you're Nextero, or you're Brookfield, or you're Copenhagen, or you're General Electric, you have no idea if it's still going to take 7 years to build a transmission line, if you're going to be able to meet the energy targets of a RGGI market or a renewable fuel standard coming out of California. And so you're kind of really putting folks in a bad spot because you're not in control of the ultimate outcome. You're just going to have to deal with the consequences one way or another. And from a very apolitical standpoint, and one where I will, as an in-house former Trump folks, I will tell you that I'm very dispassionate and rational about this particular debate, because whatever's going to happen, we need to inform it with facts and science and allow for those to make decisions about what priorities they're making from both a moral and from an environmental standpoint. Because if you don't, then we're just walking off a groupthink and a groupthink cliff, and it's going to be very hard to undo the regs once they're already in place, and we will have lost those projects that we need now more than ever.
Thank you for your comments, Alex. Chris.
Yeah, again, just to go back to the foundation here, I mean, the problem is we have an economic system that left one of the big questions out of the economic equation. All Alex was saying is true, is like, look, we've got all these laws, partly because we never put a price on carbon. Climate change is real. It's happening. It's affecting markets all over the world. And if you put a price on carbon, this all starts to rationalize itself really quickly. So it's just unfortunate that a lot of people who normally on this call would argue for market-based solutions are ignoring the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room that we all should be pushing for is a price on carbon, because I'll bet you we're still going to use a lot of fossil fuels and we're going to put it back in the ground. And so once you start to put the real economic equation is, the good news is Milton Friedman was right, the markets will work. The problem is we don't have a price on carbon. We now are putting all kinds of externalities onto the oil and gas industry because we didn't do what we should have done long ago, is price the externality of carbon into the equation. It'll rationalize, and guess what? We're going to have decarbonized pipes and wires, a lot of fossil fuels, and we're also going to solve climate change. It's really a pretty cool path. I just wish more people believed in market solutions other than regulations. And I think it's coming. Even most of the thoughtful oil and gas people now agree we need a price on carbon to make this market work.
Thank you, Chris. We're getting short on time. Tisha, you get the final commentary from the panelists.
Good, thanks, Dave. I just wanted to offer, again, a little bit different framing. The oil and gas industry has 150 years of entrepreneurial spirit in adapting to technology and energy demand and expectations of the public for how they want their energy in what form, and how it is provided to them. And so whether it's companies putting their entrepreneurial innovative foot forward, or the regulatory bodies, this time requires us to evolve. And whether it is a regulatory body or institutions like IOGCC who support them, you cannot be simultaneously defending the past or the status quo and creating the energy future. And that's the opportunity before us, is to be innovative and meeting the expectations of the public and moving into the future that they require.
Thank you so much, Tisha. Amy messaged me to let me know that there's still one more question. So hang in there, panelists. Amy, over to you.
Yes, we have a question from Kathy. Kathy, I'm asking to unmute.
All right. Am I unmuted?
You are.
Hi, my name is Kathy Beckett. I'm an environmental attorney at Steptoe and Johnson, and I practice in Appalachia. So when I look a little bit at the energy impact on, complex impacts on local communities, what I hear out of the administration is an interest in environmental justice. And so as we all talk about shared aspirations and development under supporting and bolstering our economy, our energy independence, and the thought of inclusive capitalism, tell me how do you all see environmental justice playing into the ESG dialogue? Because I see a lot of nexus.
Thank you so much for your question, Kathy. Which of our panelists would like to take that one?
I can take it. If not, dealing with this firsthand on the project side, unless anyone else, I'll defer it to anyone else if they want it. If not, I'll take it here.
Go for it.
I think it's all about the priorities that you attach, and I think it's important that environmental justice not be used as a rhetorical tool to object to new infrastructure development, like what may be happening in Houston on highways and others, where NIMBYism masquerades as environmental justice, almost delegitimizing the impacts on low and disparate income populations. And so we have to be very careful about these new standards that we're putting in place, because if we're going to implement environmental justice rules that are not there and codifying Executive Order 12896, the old Clinton Executive Order, I think it's important that we also look at the fact that 98% of the steel and the copper and the transition wires that we're going to be using to meet 2030 targets come from places in the world that not only have no environmental regulation, but have significant issues, but they're already in feedstock in the country and we're going to use them. We just can't import anymore. So at what point do we assess our value judgment, right? And what are the true impacts? Because there's also something we need, especially in Appalachia, is economic justice, right? And at some point, many of the new renewable facilities are not in economically viable areas and are in the middle of nowhere, not near communities that would actually stand to benefit. So this again goes to the transition. We have to be rational, and we can't just drop new uninformed policies on the public that have 60 seconds in their day to absorb information and then hope that everything's going to be fine. So again, it's a call for the adults.
So Kathy, I'll jump in, just as an example. What about the environmental justice of a low-income citizen in New York who can't get access to natural gas, which is an incredibly affordable fuel? So sometimes this environmental justice spins the other way. And this is one of my big arguments with the 100% electrification, 100% renewable. If you actually look who gets hurt in that environment, it's actually low-income ratepayers. So let's just use the math and science, decarbonize both the pipes and wires, and let's take it a little bit more holistically. There's no question the energy industry needs to work harder on bringing diversity and inclusion into its employment base. And I think the industry's really taking that seriously. So that's a good issue, but just be careful on some of these policies, because what I find is a lot of the unintended consequence of certain movements here is the actual lowest income group. The groups that have the least political power end up paying the price for a lot of things that are unintended. So just be careful what you think about and how you define that, because I think we can decarbonize both the pipes and wires and have affordable, clean energy.
I'll agree with Chris and Alex on the comment about access to energy. That's a perfect reason why the 200, which are 200 civil rights organizations in California, are suing the state of California for violating the Civil Rights Act. And if you haven't checked out that lawsuit, I'd highly encourage you to do so. They say the policies from the California Air Resources Board have a disparate impact on communities of color and increasing the cost. And although I'll disagree with Chris on a price of carbon and decarbonization, because again, when you look at the model that the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change uses, if you eliminate all CO2 emissions by 2030 from the United States, by 2100, it's less than 0.2 of a degree, but it does significantly increase the cost of everything we use, and that cost gets passed down to the least among us more than anyone else.
Thank you for your comments, Jason. Is there any other commentary on that? Alex, you're unmuted. Do you have a final comment on that before we wrap?
I think I've overstepped on the words that I've used. I've let, for the sake of time.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Alex. All right, Amy, are there any further questions before we wrap?
Can you hear me?
I sure can.
No more questions. We're good, and we're right on time. So,
Okay, thanks, Amy. Thank you, all of you, panelists and attendees, for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here with us today. Obviously, this is a very topical subject, a great diversity of opinions and thoughts. Hopefully, the session has proved valuable to you. Just for awareness, attendees will receive a survey asking for their feedback on the webinar and suggestions for future ESG presentations or events. Please take a few minutes to complete that survey. And with that, I will officially close this session. Thank you once again to all of you for attending. Take care.
thank you. Thanks, Dave.